This video is brought to you by Bespoke Post. Bespoke Post is a monthly membership club delivering awesome boxes of top shelf goods from under the radar brands. Every month, Bespoke Post introduces its members to cool new products, outdoor gear, barware, home and kitchen goods, clothing, and more, even live oysters, based on a preference quiz that you fill out. It's free to join and you can skip a month anytime. This is one of the first things they actually sent me. It is a weekend bag, appropriately this box called the Weekender. It's this great thick canvas material. Got these metal supports inside so that, it's not going to fall apart no matter how much stuff you stuff in there. Fantastic, great stuff. Every box has about $70 in retail value, but costs only $45. And you can preview the box before it ships and decide if you want to keep it, swap it, or skip the month for no charge. Bespoke's box lineup is also constantly changing each month, and it's great for you, but also could be a great gift. Another box they've recently sent me is this one. This was the brew box, and as it says here, it's a beer making kit. Can you guys see that? Yes, there we go. Contains everything you need to make beer. There's a giant bottle in here. It says 1 gallon. What's that in metric? Like roughly 4 liters. That's like 8 pints. Why am I going from imperial to metric to imperial? Anyway, doesn't matter. Great big bottle, everything you need, all of the tubing and piping and all of that jazz, this big beer mix as well. Fantastic. And right now you guys can get 20% off your first box by going to bspk.me/megaprojects20 or just clicking the link in the description below and entering megaprojects20 at checkout. And now back to today's video. In the previous episode of this series, we talked about humanity's first steps to the moon since the days of Apollo. Today we're going to talk about humanity's first tentative steps to our nearest celestial neighbor. If all goes to plan, LOP-G will be humanity's gateway to the solar system, starting with the moon and later Mars. It will serve as a way station, a laboratory, a lifeboat, and a bunker, or perhaps it will simply become another ambitious project lost to the complexities of politics and economics. Ever since humans first looked to the night sky and saw the moon, we conceived of the possibility that one day we might go there. But it took us until the year 1687 and the publication of Newton's history-changing book Principia Mathematica that we could begin to envisage putting an object in an orbit around our own and other celestial bodies. This was famously done with the thought study Newton's Cannonball, first illustrated in Newton's aforementioned book. In the book, he describes an unfathomably tall mountain, so tall that at its peak there is no air and no air resistance. Upon this peak, there is a loaded cannonball that once fired will be capable of launching at such a speed that it could, in a crude sense, outrun the force of gravity. It would not return to the Earth, but permanently orbit the planet until it was acted upon. While you will likely be familiar with the concept of an orbit, you may not be familiar with how they work in the mathematical sense. And to understand this, it helps to think about the forces acting on objects like you would imagine the 4 directions on a compass. Engineers and physicists do this to bring simplicity and uniformity to complicated systems where you might have thousands of forces at play, and instead combining them into 4 simple directions: up, down, left, and right. In this format, you could describe any object moving in 2 dimensions. It also works for free, but, well, we don't need to go there today. So, if you were to look at the cannonball flying around the Earth from a side view, you'd see an arrow pointing downwards towards the Earth, saying something like 9.81 meters per second, which would be the rate at which the cannonball was accelerating towards the Earth every second. If the cannonball wasn't moving forward, it would simply fall and hit the ground. But, as we have discussed, it's going at an orbital velocity. In this scenario, that would be a number somewhere between 10 or 20,000 meters per second. As it travels forwards, the Earth begins to fall away from the cannonball due to its curvature, but at the same time, gravity pulls the ball back towards the Earth, causing a constant change in its direction and velocity. Once Isaac Newton's book had widespread acceptance, it seized the imagination of scientists and authors alike. Eventually, we began to think of human-made satellites orbiting our world, and at some point, someone set their sights on the moon. Today, we are entering an age where this is not only possible, but it is potentially going to be our chosen method of opening up our solar system for future exploration and growth. As for the topic of today's video, the first mention of what we could call a space station appeared in Edward Everett Hale's book, The Brick Moon, published in 1869. But the concept of a space station, lunar or otherwise, would only begin to materialize in any kind of official capacity during the 1940s when sustained research proved that it was legitimately feasible to put a man-made object into orbit. As the 1940s turned into the 1950s and the space age began, space station concepts began to dominate popular media. It was not until 1971 that the Russians were first able to create a rudimentary space station by linking two Russian Soyuz vehicles in lower Earth orbit. As for a lunar station, it took until the year 2012 for an official body to give serious consideration to this kind of undertaking. Dubbed the Deep Space Habitat, this was NASA's first serious look at the opportunities a lunar space station might afford. Then, in 2015, after consideration, the Deep Space Habitat proposal was brought into the Next Step program, and it received its first bit of funding. Now, a project of this magnitude would need significant funding to fully realize its ambitious plans, and if there is one thing you can be certain of when it comes to NASA, it is that they will at some point just run out of money for this. Over the coming years, the Deep Space Habitat would be altered and combined with other projects that were short of funding. Further, various modules were added and removed. Finally, in 2018, it received its current designation, the Lunar Orbital Platform Gateway, or LOP-G. As of 2018, Congress has committed $332 million of funding toward the project. We could just say that we did a video on the F-35 a couple of months ago, and the funding that went into that was set at around $1.7 trillion by 2030. And we can put a space station around the moon with 0.02% of the F-35's funding. Imagine what we could do with maybe 2 or 3%. So, I'm sure defense funding is important, but also, really? Anyway, that little tangent aside, that brings you up to date with the origins of LOP-G. So maybe you want to know what LOP-G is and what exactly is its purpose. So, it's all well and good proposing to build a lunar orbital platform gateway, a space station orbiting the moon, but what precise purpose would it serve? Well, I'm glad you asked, generic viewer. It would be easy to think of this new space station as an ISS 2.0, but in reality they share very few similarities. For one thing, the actual habitable space within the new LOP-G would be significantly smaller than that of the ISS. For another, the maximum possible time that a person could spend on board the LOP-G will be significantly shorter. At first glance, both of these sound like a step in the wrong direction. After all, we're looking to expand the capacity for human exploration, so why are we choosing to reduce the habitability of our space stations? Well, to start with, the LOP-G is going to operate less like a space station and more like a robot in space. As missions to and from the moon are going to be relatively irregular, especially in the early days of the program, proposing to put a tin can around the moon that is only inhabited for 1 month of the year would be dubious at best. Far better to make it autonomously capable of carrying out experimentation during this downtime. That would mean that the space station would be fully capable of carrying out a multitude of experiments either remotely or semi-autonomously with inputs from Earth. You see, at its core, the LOP-G will be an exploration into precisely how we can push the limit of human habitability further and further from the surface of the Earth. Now, if you didn't catch the first installment of this series, we went into a lot of detail about the danger that solar radiation presents. The space station is going to be our first bit of real, sustained, in situ research into solving the solar and cosmic radiation problem. As for its habitable areas, the LOP-G will only have 2 to begin with, those being the Power and Propulsion Element, or PPE, and the Habitation and Logistics Outpost, or HALO module. The PPE module began construction at JPL, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California. When it was originally proposed, it was intended to be part of an asteroid redirection mission. However, following its cancellation, hopefully there are no asteroids heading our way, development was contracted to Maxar Technologies and it's nearing completion. This module will be exactly what it sounds like, a source of power and propulsion, but not just for the space station. This will be a transferable module that will act like a tugboat, ferrying cargo, resupplies, and manned missions between the Earth and the moon. The engines used to achieve this are called Hall effect thrusters, a vast departure from the chemical rockets of the past. If you need any more evidence that NASA is doubling down on the sci-fi nature of the space station, well, here it is. Looking like something straight out of Star Trek Wars, these thrusters are going to be humanity's method of traveling the vast distances that span our solar system. Capable of blistering speeds, you could describe these thrusters as the embodiment of slow and steady wins the race. But if you were to see one of them here on Earth, it would be difficult to tell if it was even turned on. At full power, one of these thrusters produces about the same amount of force as an apple applies when sitting in the palm of your hand. When you compare that to the dramatic and explosive scenes of a conventional chemical rocket engine taking off, this can seem like, again, a massive step back. But hold your judgment about 7 to 10 years, and you will see why this is a better solution. But before we get there, why don't we clarify the difference between a Hall effect thruster and a chemical engine? So, a chemical engine is your typical over-the-top, big flame sort of engine. It derives its thrust from the burning of rocket fuel and using the resulting expanding superheated gas to push a rocket in the opposite direction. If you've ever seen a rocket taking off in person or even on video, you will know that this form of propulsion is very loud and very bright. While this makes for a very cinematic takeoff sequence, it certainly doesn't make for a very efficient one. All of that light, sound, heat, and smoke is indicative of wasted energy. In other words, it's a highly inefficient reaction. We use these engines for a variety of reasons, the main one being that chemical engines are the only engines capable of overcoming the Earth's gravity and making it into space. However, once you make it into orbit, the level of thrust and inefficiency just isn't necessary. This is where Hall effect thrusters come in. Now that there are a plethora of videos on YouTube that can explain these thrusters with as much detail as you might need, far better than we can today. But in our own short version, these thrusters are pretty much as close as we can get to an electronic method of propulsion. As we are restricted in time today by having to describe the rest of the space station, I'll give you the short description. In essence, these thrusters work by accelerating tiny quantities of propellant such as xenon or krypton to very, very high speeds. The chosen propellant is sent into a containment chamber. Thanks to the use of something like magnetic fields, there are a lot of electrons inside this chamber spinning around very, very fast. These electrons will smash into the atoms of propellant, removing some of the electrons from their shells and causing them to become ions. An anode then repels these newly formed ions out of the engine at speeds approaching and exceeding 15 kilometers a second. This flurry of atoms imparts their equal and opposite momentum to the spaceship, which over the course of a few minutes of usage doesn't amount to a large change in velocity. But over the course of months, and in some cases years, said spaceship will slowly accelerate to speeds of 30,000 meters a second and greater. Theoretically, it's possible to reach 90,000 meters a second, but the best we can do with today's technology is about 45 kilometers per second, which, is still bloody fast. Next, we have the Habitation and Logistics Outpost, which, again, does exactly what it says on the tin. It's also known as the Minimal Habitation Module. It will be built in a similar spec to the ISS in that it will serve as your usual run-of-the-mill habitation module. Well, we say run-of-the-mill, but it's still going to cost about $1 billion, which is pretty tame by US standards. But this won't be all that different from what you might find attached to the ISS, with the notable exception of only being able to support a crew of 4 for around 30 days consecutively. The design and fabrication of this module has been contracted out to Northrop Grumman, and it is being launched with the PPE module, which is slated to go in November 2024. However, if past experience is anything to go by, well, that date's going to get pushed back several more months or maybe even years. There are a couple of other modules that have been agreed upon with a slightly looser launch schedule, these being the Internal Habitation Module, or IHAB, and the European System Providing Refueling Infrastructure and Telecommunications, or ISPIRIT for short. Starting with the IHAB module, this is essentially going to house the extension to the first habitation module, providing a combined 125 cubic meters of space within the station itself. This doesn't sound like a lot, but bear in mind that the average New York apartment is 866 square feet, which means very little in this context, because comparing square feet and cubed meters is like comparing a piece of paper to a plank of wood. It's a bit pointless. Moving swiftly on from that tangent, which was not useful at all, we arrive at the ISPIRIT module, which, despite what the name might suggest, is actually quite an interesting addition to the station. A short description of such a module would be that it's the LOP-G secondary storage, sort of a utility closet, if your utility closet had an airlock, communications equipment, and standard storage for xenon and hydrazine. And whose doesn't? Early design studies were led by Airbus, who came up with the current design in October 2019, and it was approved for construction in November of that year. As of right now, the Spirit construction is nearing completion. It's set to go up with a habitation and logistics outpost in 2024. As of this video, these are the only modules to have been approved for construction. There are several other proposed modules, such as the Gateway Airlock module, Canadarm3, and the Gateway Logistic modules. However, these are only in the early stages of research and are not guaranteed to receive funding as of yet. Just like with the ISS, the Gateway is looking to be a milestone in human engineering. The ISS, because of the sheer size of the project, the LOP-G, for the sheer distance away from Earth that it is. To give you an idea of the undertaking at hand here, the ISS took 10 years to be constructed and was built over the course of 30 missions from crewed space shuttles. As of yet, there are only 3 confirmed flights carrying parts to the LOP-G. The ISS is about 400 kilometers from the surface of the Earth, so 800 kilometers for the space shuttle to travel there and back. Over 30 missions, that comes out to a total of 24,000 vertical kilometers traveled in order to complete construction. In one mission to the moon, that distance will be covered 16 times over, and there are already 3 missions needed to construct the LOP-G. Needless to say, the challenges this presents are astounding, and that's without actually mentioning the fact that NASA intends to complete the new station at a fraction of the budget of the ISS. So, let's talk about the new project. How are they going to do it? Well, to start with, NASA intends to cut costs by using a tool that they didn't have in the space shuttle days: commerce. NASA have outsourced some of the most costly aspects of the space mission to various companies. The biggest cost-cutting measure is the utilization of third-party launching companies such as SpaceX and Blue Origin, who bid for the contract to shuttle parts for these missions. SpaceX ultimately won out, so they'll carry the PPE and Halo modules on the back of their Falcon Heavy rocket to the moon in November 2024. This will be the first of 3 deliveries that will begin to build the space station from the ground up. The next proposed delivery following SpaceX will be the IHAB module, which is to be delivered by NASA's own SLS rocket. This will also be the first crewed mission to the space station and will be a part of the Artemis 5 mission. The majority of the actual assembly work will have been done on the ground, so once they're up there, it will simply be a matter of attaching one docking port to another and then making sure that they don't break apart. This will be a modular station, allowing for flexibility in how the station is laid out and the ability to add or remove modules as needed. This makes it difficult to say when the station will be finished in the conventional sense. In the case of the ISS, there have been many different module layouts and modules that have been added or removed. Over time, as our presence on the moon and possibly Mars grows, there will obviously be a need to expand the capacity, capability, and functions of the LOP-G. Okay, so with all of that said, there are 2 things that we still need to explain: the where and the how. The where will be the Shackleton crater at the lunar South Pole. This is going to be where the lunar base is situated on the lunar surface. We went into some detail about this crater and why it was chosen as the site of the lunar base in the previous video, so we won't go into too much detail now. But a short explanation would just be that it was a better choice than all of the other craters. Anyway, that just leaves us with the how. The mission will require a near rectilinear halo orbit, NRHO, and well, what does all of that mean? Pretty much all that describes is the kind of orbit the LOP-G will have around the moon. As the focus of most lunar activity will be on the Shackleton crater, NASA needed an orbit that permits easy access to and from that site while not breaking contact with the Earth, meaning they needed an orbit that doesn't put them on the far side of the moon. Thanks to these and a few other requirements, NASA decided that the best option would be the NRHO. This is a highly elliptical orbit, which means that the station doesn't simply track a perfect circle around the planet, rather it forms more of an oval. At its closest point, it will be roughly 3,000 kilometers from the surface, which is intended to be directly over the South Pole. At its furthest point, it will be roughly 70,000 kilometers away. This point will bring it just above the lunar North Pole. This configuration will make going to and from the lunar surface possible with the least amount of fuel. So, let's say we've got our space station up there in lunar orbit. We have our moon base all set up and it's in full working order. What's all that gonna look like? Well, let's pitch a certain mission in which the aim is to take some astronauts from Earth to the moon. Launching on either SpaceX's Falcon Heavy or NASA's SLS rocket, the crew would be sent up to low Earth orbit. Once reaching the final stage, all that's left is the Orion module. At this point in the mission, they would meet the PPE in orbit and initiate a docking procedure. The PPE will also be refueled, either in the days preceding the mission or by fuel brought along with the astronauts. Following this, the spacecraft would maneuver into an optimal position to approach the moon and then carry out a maneuver called the Hohmann transfer orbit. Best we can tell, there is isn't an official estimate for how long it would take to make the journey from the Earth to the Moon. However, the generally accepted timeline for a transfer to the Moon using the Hoffman transfer orbit is 5 days. Whether this takes into account the reduced acceleration of the Hall effect thrusters, we don't know, so we'll just make an educated guess that it's going to take 5 to 10 days, although if you have a better idea, do let us know in the comments. Upon approaching the Moon, the astronauts will need to carry out an action to reduce their relative velocity. They'll then need to match the space station's orbit. It would be at this point that the module would slip into the aforementioned NRHO and eventually meet back up with the main body of the space station. Following docking, the crew would disembark into the habitable areas of the space station, where they would remain until it's their time to descend to the lunar surface. While in the space station, the crew would fill their time with experimentation, organization, and preparation for the next stage of their mission. The station is rated to support a crew of 4 for at least 30 days. However, with future upgrades, this could increase, but as this is to serve as more of a rest stop, there will be little need for the astronauts to be up there for that long. As the station is for the most part automated, there will be many experiments going on upon their arrival. What this will look like, we just don't know. There's just not a great deal of information about how the automation is going to look, although if it's anything like we're imagining, it's going to be a bunch of robotic arms floating around and doing random stuff like an episode of Wallace and Gromit. Moving on from that mental image, we can fast forward to the next stage of our crew's mission, which will be disembarking into a fully fueled Orion module or starship. If you're wondering about those, have a look at our last video about the Artemis missions as a whole. Once they're ready, the ship will detach from the LOP-G and go on. If the mission is to Mars, the crew will use several burns to put them on a trajectory that will bring them to our nearest neighbor in a timeline of 3 to 9 months. If they are headed down to the lunar surface, they will wait until orbit takes them above the lunar North Pole, at which point they will slow themselves down, carrying their craft gently down to the surface. By the time they're at a near absolute standstill, they will have been carried to the opposite side of the Moon and will be somewhere near the Shackleton crater, where they will land and begin whatever comes next for mankind. With the first launch date of the Artemis mission fast approaching and very few indicators that this one is going to be cancelled, it's clear to see that we are truly on the cusp of a new space age. Out of the billions of humans that have lived and died throughout the course of history, it was us that were lucky enough to watch as mankind became an interplanetary species. There may come a time in the future, assuming mankind is able to fix its ills, where our descendants look back on us and our time and recall very little of what went on with regard to wars, politicians, politics, disputes on the budget, etc. It's all going to be lost to history. But they will know that we did something that had a lasting impact, that opened up the rest of the solar system, and perhaps someday, even the rest of the galaxy. And it all started with us and our dedication to progress. So I really hope you found this video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe. Thank you for watching.